So, Len Masterman, I'm just going to ask you a question about your own intellectual backdrop, where you're coming from, what tradition you're coming from, what are the most dominant, I guess, intellectual traditions that contributed to your own growth and development.
It's a good question, that, really, because I don't think of myself as actually being formed by particular intellectual traditions, although I guess we all are. I mean, I was an English teacher in a school, and what I was formed by was the kids, and the way that the kids were actually responding or were not responding to what I wanted to do. I mean, I guess when I came out of university as an English graduate and did postgraduate work, that was in literature, but my real interest was in films, and that actually was quite common at the time, and I was quite interested in European cinema and the French New Wave cinema and so on. Art house cinema, I guess. And it just seemed quite a reasonable thing to do, to incorporate that into one's English teaching as a way of kind of extending the kids' experience and so on. As I taught more and more in state schools, I was, as every English teacher I guess has to at some stage, you find yourself teaching fairly large numbers of kids who are pretty uncomfortable with print. And it's quite a difficult task to teach English and primarily a literary-based curriculum with kids who associate, the print on a piece of paper with failure and don't want to have anything to do with it. So it then seemed to me to be fairly obvious that one had to move over to film in a fairly major way as a way of teaching pretty much the same ideas and concepts that one would be teaching within literature. Why should kids who can't read be denied the opportunity of discussing ideas and images and social issues and themes and narratives and so on, simply because they don't have access to literary culture? So, I mean, I did that to some degree, and it worked quite successfully. But, I mean, to give you an example of the kind of ignorance that I was bringing to bear on that kind of task, I mean, the thing I would do would be to take in some film extracts from European films, and the subtitled films, and I would show them to the kids, and we'd watch an extract for 10 minutes, and then we'd have a little bit of a discussion, I thought, and what would happen is that there would be no discussion at all. And I would say things like, well, has anybody got anything at all to say about, this Buñuel film or something? And nobody did. And I said, well, would somebody like to tell me anything that happened in the extract? Anything about the narrative or anything about the people you saw? Nobody did. I said, well, what is the problem here? And they said, well, the subtitles were going past so quickly that we couldn't actually, we actually completely lost interest. And of course, what I was doing was bringing films with writing on as a way of liberating the curriculum. And it was the kind of the classic mistake that you make. So, I mean, the major intellectual moves that I've made have been guided by really what would consider, kids who are failures in school. It's ways of, I mean, what always interested me was ways of making connections with the kinds of experiences of the media that kids have themselves. And of course that quickly moves you over to popular film, the kinds of things that they're watching at the local cinema. And when you try to do that, you very quickly discover that all the local cinemas are closing down, and the kids actually haven't seen a movie, apart from what they see on television, for years. So you can, in a very liberal way, start to talk about Hitchcock and John Ford and whoever else, but you may as well be talking about Shakespeare and Keats and Shelley, for all the connection it's actually making. So, I mean, what I'm describing here is a process of 5 or 6 years where I'm actually, I suppose, getting sensitized by the kids. Sensitized is a funny word for it, because it's a fairly brutal process. But I've always made the assumption that if the kids weren't actually responding to the stuff I was taking in, that there was something wrong with that, not that there was something wrong with the kids. So, I mean, fairly quickly, I suppose, over a period of 2 or 3 years, I quickly moved into recognizing that it was television that was the staple diet of kids, and that if you wanted to talk with kids in a way that interested them, and get them to discuss issues of interest to them that connected with their own life situations, then you had to be talking about TV. Now, that was in the early to mid-70s, and really no one was working with TV at that stage. And I spent 4 years really trying to crack TV in terms of trying to understand how one could study TV programs in a fairly disciplined way. You know, what were the key ideas that needed to be developed and could be transferred from program to program and genre to genre, and what was at the basis of the way that kids were reading TV, watching TV, and the way that TV was working on them. So it was a fairly slow process, but it doesn't amount to much of an intellectual tradition. And I suppose that one of the key moments, I guess, was the translation of Roland Barthes' Mythologies in 1972. It had originally been published in 1956, I think, in France, and taken that long to get into English. And what was interesting about that was that it was immediately making connections with what I was trying to do. It was written before TV, actually, but he was looking at the way that the media worked as myth, and the whole naturalizing process of television, the way in which it presents images in a dehistoricized, depoliticized way. What Barthes actually said is that what struck him most about the media was its decorative display of what goes without saying. It's the taken for granted nature of the images, and what Mythologies was an attempt to say, now, hold on a minute, what's actually going on here? So I suppose that amounts to an intellectual tradition, that whole semiotic tradition that made immediate connections with what I was trying to do. And then I suppose somebody like Stuart Hall was talking in the late 70s and early 80s about the whole encoding, decoding process and the importance of reading images. And I guess that the way in which people were talking, people again like Stuart Hall, but people like Gramsci, who was translated from the Italian. The work was written in the 20s, of course, but translated for the first time in English in 1972, the Prison Notebooks, talking there about the whole nature of the way in which ideology worked through consent, rather than through imposition from the top downwards, and the way in which subordinate groups within society were
actually being addressed in a way that
they expressed their own interests.
And in that work, sort of collaborating, I suppose,
With their own subordination, you know, and how does that process work? So what was happening there was that the mundane process of watching TV was actually linking up with what was happening to theories of ideology, the notion that ideology is expressed through, not through false consciousness, but through what we most take for granted, through our unquestioned and untheorized actions and practices and beliefs. And that's certainly linked with what my sense was of what TV was doing. And what I think semiology and theories of ideology both did was to home in on that whole business of the importance of the naturalization of the image within TV, and the fact that most of us, for most of the time, and certainly this applies to most kids, simply read TV as being, you know, a window on the world. Don't read it as a construct, and that became the kind of core idea that it was important, it seemed to me, for us all, kids, adults, anybody, to look at television as a set of representational systems that have been encoded and that we need to actively read rather than simply accept.
Okay, well, so what are some of the strategies that you use when you go into the classroom and you begin to decode, let's say, an ad?
Yeah.
How do you go about that,
Yeah.
doing that in your own work?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that studying the media doesn't just involve a change of labels on the timetable. You're actually talking about a new way of working with kids. And my own feeling is that for any media class with any age group, you know, whether it's postgraduates or it's 7 or 8-year-old kids, that you begin with an object of reflection. You begin with something that's taken from the culture. You begin with something that you can reflect upon, that raises some interesting problems either for you or for the kids. The kids themselves can actually choose the material if they want. There's nothing sacrosanct about the content. And that's an interesting process because it breaks the normal teacher-student hierarchies. In the teaching of most subjects, the teacher is an accredited expert, and he or she possesses the knowledge or the information which is inevitably passed down. The process is a hierarchical one to students who are presumed to be ignorant. It's what Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, calls the banking concept of education. You deposit the knowledge and information on the largely passive and presumably ignorant students. What's interesting about that process is that it tends not to develop and inculcate a critical attitude. Because if the student, even if the tutor wants the student to be critical, if the student is being critical, he is being critical of the tutor and the tutor's own material and knowledge, yeah? That the personality of the tutor is very much tied up with his or her expertise, yeah? If you're an English teacher, you are bringing this poem that you value into the class, yeah? If you're a historian, you are selecting these as important questions and problems. And that doesn't, I mean, that encourages passivity, I think, rather than critical analysis, as does the sort of dominant passive mode. So what happens if you put an ad up on a screen or you project a film or whatever, is that immediately the relationships change. That suddenly we, as you're the teacher, I'm the student, but we're together looking at the object out there. Yeah? And we can talk about it and we can discuss it, and you can be critical of it, or I can be critical of that without being critical of you. In other words, the media are transmitting knowledge and information and ideas laterally, and we can come in at it, and knowledge isn't actually passed down. We are creating our own knowledge through our own critical interaction with whatever the text is. Yeah? So that knowledge, I mean, that's a whole new epistemology. Knowledge isn't something that is out there that we have got to accommodate ourselves to. You know, we've got to learn, and we've got to actually employ every short-term memory technique that we know in order to pass some wretched exam, which will actually consist of giving the tutor back the stuff that he's given to us, yeah? Almost pure regurgitation. Criticism, no thanks. What I think studying the media does is to posit a whole new theory of knowledge, and that is that knowledge is something that you create, that you make your own, and you do that through your critical interaction with the world out there, and that changes it. It changes the world, it acts upon it, and through reflection we can then begin to say, well, how should it be different? That's the importance of seeing TV or media as a construct. If you see it as reality, you can't change it, you can't question it. It's a bit like questioning a tree or a cloud or whatever. If you see it as a construct, you're immediately saying, well, who's doing the constructing? Yeah? Who's behind it? Who's producing it? For what purposes? Using what techniques? For what audience? With what intention? Whose interests are being served? And so on. So, I mean, talking about media is much, much more than saying, let's have another subject, yeah? It's actually about a new way of working. It's about using many, many more participatory techniques. You know, kids have got to be involved and on the inside of the construction process. It means not only looking at TV, not only analysing text, but making yourself, you know, making your own news programs, making your own TV, using photographs, and so on and so forth. So it's a much more dynamic process where there's a total interaction of theory and practice.
Okay. Well, how realistic is that? Or there's two parts of this question. Is how realistic is that to get kids involved in the production of their own media? And given the fact of economics and all that kind of stuff. Sure. And also, how successful is this strategy? I mean, one of the faults that I see in that is that you make people critically aware of what's going on and how something is constructed. And oftentimes, especially in education, in high school, even university, it stops there. And what happens is, of course, you create a much more literate or informed consumer. So, how do you go about tackling these kind of questions as an educator?
Right. Well, there's about three questions there, aren't there, really? Let's take the first one. I absolutely agree with you about practical work. By practical work, I don't mean elaborate production. That's very time-consuming. It's rather expensive. And on the whole, most of the work I've seen in that area tends to be reproductive. It actually tries to copy and imitate the kind of stuff that the kids habitually watch on television, and doesn't succeed on that level. By practical work, I really think of much more homely stuff. It's messing about with images. It's actually creating your own photo play. It's actually doing slide tape presentations. It's actually doing news production just by moving still pictures around. I don't know, perhaps, designing the front page of a newspaper from material that you're given. It's doing a 5-minute current affairs program with masses of material that the kids have got to sift through. So what I think of it of is, or how I conceptualize it, isn't as production. It's what I would call critical practice. And the way that works can be, I mean, if you've got a TV, just a single TV camera, and we're studying, let's say, interviews on TV, look at a few interviews, look at the dominant modes, the dominant range of techniques that are available, and then try them out, ourselves, and play with the conventions, and play with the codes. This is very fresh in my mind because I've just actually been doing a session with some 14-year-olds on news, and they did a news simulation. They made their own news program, made a 5-minute program from some material that I gave them. But what I asked them to do was to change one of the things, change one of the conventions. And it didn't matter what it was, but just to do one thing that was very different. And it was amazing because one of the groups shot everything in close-up. Yeah, the newsreader was shot in tight close-up, all the interviews were done in tight close-up. What was brilliant about that was that it revealed a code that we normally take for granted and that we don't read as a code at all. That there is actually a very respectful distance that we have from newsreaders. They're telling us the truth. We don't have that interrogative mode which the close-up actually signifies. Another group, for instance, didn't use any reporters. Yeah? If they covered a story, the people who were the main participants in the story reported it for themselves. Brilliant, because it reveals that every story that's produced on the news is actually mediated to us, that people aren't allowed to speak for themselves. Yeah? We get everything at second hand. Mm-hmm. So it's really, I call them code-breaking exercises, playing it. Then what we do is we go back to the news and see the ways in which the work we've been doing actually alters our perceptions of what's going on there. So I see it as a complete integration of what I call critical practice and practical criticism. And that's a long way, really, from, what most people would think of as being production.
Right. Well, the other part of the question was, if you remember that far back, is a lot of what goes on in media literacy and cultural studies and analysis, as I said, allows people to look at the media and their culture in a creative way and see how it's constructed. But it rarely goes beyond that. I, in my own work, I sort of sense it as a teacher that when I do my stuff, I know that I'm going to get students that are going to be good at looking at ads, but perhaps it doesn't sink in. I mean, that they're part of a system there that create their values as well. I mean, they play with that. They engage with it in a playful way, but I don't think that they go the next step forward. I mean, that's a pedagogical problem, which I don't know how to go about.
Well, I think that I would say there are a number of things there. First of all, I don't underestimate the importance of producing a population which has a critical attitude towards the mass media. That seems to me to be absolutely essential to the preservation of democratic values. So I don't underestimate the significance and importance of that at all. As far as connecting with wider issues and wider questions, I mean, I think there are 2 points. First is that any decent media course will have a fairly strong practical element, and the kids will be learning how to express themselves through a variety of media, so that there will be a sense in which these things are much more available to them than they would be if they were simply being educated through print culture. The third thing, I think, is that a good media studies class should link up with and home in on current controversial issues, the current debates that are going on about the media and within the media. And some of the most important debates of our time are actually media-orientated debates. And we should be, as cultural and media studies teachers, be giving kind of historical and philosophic and political contextualizing to those debates. So, I mean, I think that's important, to produce a media literate citizenry. Goes beyond simply getting people in the privacy of their own homes to kind of like decode adverts or documentaries or whatever. It's producing an informed, articulate citizenry that can actually affect important debates about social representation, about how social knowledge is constructed. You know, it's definitions of ourselves that are at stake here, and that's actually important. And I think we've seen over the past decade really quite important movements where people with a particular subcultural or political or environmental interest have actually got together and actually have affected the kind of images that are in circulation. And I think there's much more sensitivity on the part of journalists to those kinds of things. The other thing, of course, is that a lot of media courses around the world are actively linked to the training of journalists themselves. And that's important too, that journalists should understand that there's more to what they're doing than simply writing stories, that, you know, that in dealing with representations, they actually have to think about a whole range of very sensitive issues that entails. And I think that in Finland, for instance, and in Malaysia, where I've been working, the training of journalists is very much, or the best journalist is very much tied in with cultural studies programs and media studies programs, where the students are exposed to a much wider range of ideas than simply, you know, the kind of technicist approach of learning shorthand and you know, getting the story and so on.